Hi and welcome. The biggest problem in Europe and America is the huge disparity between the people and the elites. The corrupt elites live in a separate bubble and have very little contact with ordinary citizens. They are mostly interested in expanding their power and wealth, not by cooperating with, but rather at the expense of average people. The relationship between people and their elites is that of a slave and his master. It's a toxic relationship, and it is further complicated by a significant foreign influence, such as large corporations, international financiers, and by foreign lobby groups. There's a very interesting presentation made by a former KGB officer, Yuri Bezmenov, about how to subvert a nation. There's a link below to the full presentation. Here's a key fragment from that interview.
What subversion is? Basically, it consists of four periods, time-wise. If we start from here and go this way, time, right? This is the beginning point. The first stage of subversion is the process which is called, basically, demoralization. It says for itself what it is. It takes from, say, 15 to 20 years to demoralize a society. Why 15 or 20 years? This is the time sufficient to educate one generation. Sometimes when I describe all the methods, students ask me question, are you sure this is the result of the Soviet influence? Not necessarily. You see, the tactic of subversion, about which I'm talking, is similar to the martial art, the Japanese martial art. If some of you are familiar with that tactic, probably you will remember that if an enemy is bigger and heavier than yourself, it would be very painful to resist his direct strike. If a heavier person wants to strike me in the face, it would be very naive and counterproductive to stop his blow. The Chinese and Japanese judo art tells us what to do. First to avoid the strike, then to grab the fist and continue his movement in the direction where it was before, right? Until the enemy crashes in the wall. You see? So, what happens here? The target country obviously does something wrong. If it's a free democratic society, there are many different movements within the society. There are obviously, in every society, there are people who are against this society. They may be simple criminals, ideologically in disagreement with the state policy, conscientious enemies, simply psychotic personalities who are against anything, right? And finally, there are a small group of agents of a foreign nation, bought, subverted, recruited, right? The moment all these movements will be directed in one direction, right? This is the time to catch that movement and to continue it until the movement forces the whole society into collapse, into crisis, right? So that's exactly the martial art tactic. We don't stop an enemy. We let him go. We help him to go in the direction we want them to go. Okay? These are the areas of application of subversion. What it means exactly? In case of religion, destroy it, ridicule it, replace it with various sects, cults, which bring people's attention, faith, whether it is naive, primitive, doesn't really matter. As long as the basically accepted religious dogma is being slowly eroded. Education. Distract them from learning something which is constructive, pragmatic, efficient. Instead of mathematics, physics, foreign languages, chemistry, teach them history of urban warfare, natural food, home economy, your sexuality, anything, as long as it takes you away, okay? Social life. replace traditionally established institutions and organizations with fake organizations. Take away the initiative from people. Take away the responsibility from naturally established links between individuals, group of individuals, and society at large, and replace them with artificially, bureaucratically controlled bodies. Instead of social life and friendship between neighbors, establish social workers institutions. People who are on payroll of whom? Society? No. Bureaucracy. The natural bodies of administration, which are traditionally either elected by people at large or appointed by elected leaders of society, are being actively substituted by artificial bodies. The bodies of people, groups of people, whom nobody elected. Never. As a matter of fact, most of the people don't like them at all, and yet they exist. One of such group is media. Who elected them? How come they have so much power? Almost monopolistic power on your mind. They can rape your mind. But who elected them? How come they have a nerve to decide what is good and what is bad for the elected by you, president, and his administration?
In the US, only 6 companies own about 90% of all the media. The same level of concentration also exists in other countries. In Sweden, for example, only 4 companies own over 70% of the media. The biggest one is owned by the Bonnier family. The family has German Jewish roots and came to Sweden in the 19th century. All of the mainstream media in Sweden, including that owned by the Bonnier family, is for globalism, pro-immigration, and they promote leftist and cultural Marxist ideas. These tables show the political preferences of Swedish journalists and the outcome of the 2014 parliamentary election. The moderate party is considered right-wing or center-right in Sweden, but it's actually a fake right-wing party. They are in favor of keeping the social model with its high taxes, and they are also in favor of political correctness, and they support mass immigration. The center party, the Christian Democrats, and the Folkpartiet, or the People's Party, are just as fake as the moderate party. The Social Democrats is a leftist party, but it too is a fake party. It's only the Sweden Democrats who is acting as a real opposition. They are the only ones who are against mass immigration, and they are treated horribly by the establishment. But even the Sweden Democrats are pretty mainstream oriented on some issues, for example on rights for sexual minorities. On 80% of the issues, most of these parties have the same views. There is no real political pluralism in Sweden. In the left table, you can see that the center-right parties, even though they are fake parties, have a lower representation amongst journalists than in society in general. The Sweden Democrats received almost 13% of the vote. Now they have even greater support, but only 1% of journalists support them. I was actually surprised that they even got 1%. Given the extreme politically correctness in Sweden, I'd expect that any reporter who supports the Sweden Democrats would get fired immediately. Continuing to the Social Democrats, even though they are very much for Sweden becoming a multicultural state, this party has a relatively small representation in the media. They received 31% of votes, but only 14% of journalists support them. The Social Democrats are not radical enough. Instead, journalists in Sweden support mostly communists and the Green Party, who are basically green communists. The leftist Communist Party received less than 6% of the votes, but 15% of journalists support them. As for the Greens, they got less than 7% of votes, but a staggering 41% of journalists support. 41%. That is just incredible. The Communists and the Greens are both extremely radical parties. If given power, they will dismantle Sweden. This is probably the best evidence of the influence the globalists have in the Swedish media. If anybody has doubts about this, then show them this statistic. It is just amazing. The owners of the media companies are responsible for this. They are the ones who hire the editors, who then hire all of these journalists. The decision who gets a job comes from the top. Only those who have politically correct views, who are in favor of mass immigration, are anti-gun, and generally in favor of the nanny state, will get hired. These views are then spread to all of Sweden, and that is a big part of the reason why this country is extremely politically correct today. This is what Yuri Bezmenov was talking about. The globalists introduce their agents into different positions in society. They introduce politically correct journalists. They introduce agents in culture, in businesses, in politics. And then these agents then spread these Marxist ideas. And after a few decades, you take a country like Sweden, and it has become an extremely politically correct society, which looks nothing like it used to. And these agents, they can be doing the bidding of the globalists knowingly or unknowingly. In fact, it's better that they don't know what the globalists are up to. If you have a journalist who is extremely pro-immigration, it's actually better for a, let's say, owner of a company, of a media company, to hire a person that doesn't see the big picture, that is simply pro-immigration, like Yuri Bezmenov says. For example, psychotic people. You take a psychopath, which has exactly the views that the globalists want. They want the same thing, but the psychopath doesn't know what the end game is. So the globalist hires a psychopath as a journalist, and then the journalist does the bidding of the globalist. Anybody asks this journalist, why are you doing this? Why are you destroying your own country? What's he gonna say? Well, he's gonna say that he's for pro-immigration because he actually believes that is a good thing. He's for political correctness because that is what he believes. So in his mind, and truthfully, he will answer, there is no agenda, there is no conspiracy. And that is true from his point of view, but he was put in his position by some higher up globalist for his specific views. It's quite ingenious, actually. Very clever. The globalists in Sweden also have a stronghold over politics, business, and education. It's getting harder and harder to find traditional Swedish values in Sweden. Some politicians have even gone so far as to say that Sweden has no culture. All of the culture in Sweden has been brought to the country by immigrants. That is a lie. Of course, Sweden has a culture, but the problem is that the traditional Swedish culture is in the way of a one world global government, which is the end goal of the globalists. The same goes for German culture, Polish culture, Italian culture, and so on. In 1975, the Swedish parliament voted in favor of becoming a multicultural country. In other words, that was the year when the Swedish parliament voted to dismantle Sweden. The politicians betrayed Sweden. So did the mainstream media. The same goes for judges, most of the big businesses, and a large part of the intellectuals. Sweden is oftentimes at the forefront of introducing leftist progressive reforms, such as introducing multiculturalism, the cashless society, and censorship. I feel that Sweden has basically been turned into a gigantic social experiment where the globalists can try out different ideas before they introduce them in other countries. That is why people cannot turn to these elites for solutions. The solution has to come from ordinary people, the grassroots, and I mean a real grassroots movement, not a fake grassroots movement created by the menacing elites. Even if the migration problem is solved, soon the globalists would come up with a new scheme to destroy our societies, and people will have to fight a new battle. The war will not be won until the corrupt elites have been replaced. That includes the cultural leftist journalists, the corrupt politicians, the international financiers who own much of the banking system, and the owners of media conglomerates.